Good evening and welcome to Tonight with Vincent Browne. I'm Kevin Myers and I'm standing in for him tonight. Next week it'll be the ineffably handsome and charming Sam Smith. This evening we'll be looking at the issue of climate change, also known as global warming, and wondering just how seriously we should take it. With me in the studio are Joe Caulfield from Turn 180, Professor Ray Bates from UCD's School of Mathematical Sciences, Gerald Fleming from Met Éireann, Ultan Murphy, also from Turn 180, and Gavin Harte from Friends of the Earth. Marion McKeown and Anton Savage will be with me here after the break to preview tomorrow's papers. If you'd like to contact the show, you can text the word tonight followed by your comment to 53131, or you can email us at tonight@tv3.ie. And don't forget, there's a live blog at the politico.ie. First of all, to you, Joe, you belong to this organisation, Turn 180. A lot of people won't have heard of what you are, so tell us, what are you?
Well, we're a group of global warming skeptics. We're an activist group. We're a group of concerned citizens in terms of how our government is coming back in September to introduce a climate change bill. What they're going to be doing is they're going to be addressing a warming trend that simply is not happening. It's going to be based on CO2 human emissions, of which there is no correlation between CO2 human emissions and a warming trend. Instead, what we want them to do is to address the cooling trend, which we are now in, which is based on solar activity. As you know, the proponents of global warming refer to the 2007 IPCC report consistently and constantly. The IPCC report from 2007 says in its summary that they are 90% certain that human beings are causing a warming trend. Now, that 90% is not scientific, it is not conclusive, and provides no evidence in the experimental field.
Okay, you've touched on a number of points there. So I'm going to ask Gavin, you to respond to what you've just heard, and there are many other points we'll come to later on. He's a skeptic. Throw away his skepticism, destroy him.
Oh, I couldn't do that. No, but I think, look, there's always going to be skeptics. I mean, it took 200 years for the world to realise that it was round, you know. They still thought it was flat.
A little bit longer than 200 years. But,
probably. I think there's always going to be people who have difficulty in understanding the science of climate change. And the trouble now really is that we move beyond the debate, because really science is clear. 90%, if you went to a doctor and the doctor said there's a 90% chance that you have very serious cancer, I think we would take it terribly seriously. And that's really where the science is at. Of course, like all scientific studies, like evolution or any other concepts, there is room for manoeuvre and debate and movement. And I think that's the scientific field, that's the game of science.
But you're not actually responding to his, and I know this is not a scientific program, and we will lose our audience very rapidly if we go into the minutiae of science here, but he does maintain that there isn't any connectivity between human behaviour.
I've heard this before. He's plain wrong. I mean, that's the unfortunate truth of it.
You're his companion here, Ultan. How is he right? How is he right? Tell me he's right.
Very simply, there is no relationship between the human emissions of CO2 and global temperatures. And if you look at the 20th century, which is used as an example where humans have been responsible for CO2 emissions and rising temperatures. If you look between, say, 1910 and 1940, temperatures went up by 0.5 a degree, and human emissions went from 0.5 billion tonnes to 4 billion tonnes. And between 1940 and 1975, CO2 emissions went from 4 billion tonnes to 20 billion tonnes, and yet the temperatures fell for 35 years. Now, the temperatures fell by 0.5 a degree. And, you know, that has been rearranged of recent, but in 1975 and 1976, Newsweek and National Geographic published peer-reviewed studies showing that the temperature of the globe cooled between by 0.35 and 5 degrees Celsius. Now, there is no relationship between human emissions and global temperatures. It's fair enough that CO2 causes some degree of warming, but for our belief, or our understanding, and like thousands of others, it plays no part in the real atmosphere.
I'd like to turn to Ger, the Brad Pitt of weather forecasting in Ireland.
Thank you.
Ger, you obviously don't agree with that. Where is he wrong?
The relationship between atmospheric composition and temperature is not monotonic, it's not straightforward. In other words, if we put in an extra 10% at the beginning, we don't get an extra 10% out at the end. There are many, many factors in weather. There are cycles in weather, cycles of years, cycles of decades, and they are overlain on what's happening in an underlying sense. So what do we know for certain? We know for certain that carbon dioxide has increased, and it's increased significantly from around about 270 parts per million to about 380 parts per million. So it's increased by around about a third over what we call its pre-industrial level. And we know that that's because we've been pumping it out there. We know how much oil we burn, how much coal we burn, and we can do those calculations. That's straightforward. We know that temperatures have increased in the latter part of the 20th century especially, and not just that they've increased, but they've increased very quickly during the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s.
Can I just ask, can you prove there's a connection between carbon dioxide emissions and that temperature increase? Can you prove it?
Can we prove it? We know that carbon dioxide is active in absorbing radiation, in absorbing heat, so we would expect it to lead to the rise. How do we prove it? Well, I'm an experimental scientist. Now, if you ask me how would I prove it, I would say, well, I'd like two worlds, please, and in one of them I'll pump up the carbon dioxide, and in the other one I'll leave it as it is, and we'll see what happens. I can't do that, obviously. So how do we prove it? We prove it as best we can by creating mathematical models of how the atmosphere works, and these are something that I, as a weather forecaster, have worked with for most of my 30 years in the business. And we do the tweaks on the mathematical models, and we use those to see what way the atmosphere will respond.
Ray.
Yes, well, based on the scientific evidence, overall, I take the issue of climate change as a very serious threat for humanity in the long term. Of course, there isn't, as Jerry said, there isn't a monotonic relationship between increasing CO2 and increasing temperature. There's a lot of natural variability in the climate system, mainly due to variations in the ocean. But if we look at the past 100 years, the temperature has gone up by about 0.8 of a degree. And there are very good reasons to think that CO2 has an influence in this. The glaciers are retreating all around the world at the moment, not everywhere, but most glaciers are in retreat. Sea level is rising at about 3.2 millimeters per year, which is a very significant increase on what the rise was during the 20th century.
Well, even allowing for the fact that these phenomena are occurring, you cannot prove it's not solar activity which is causing this.
Well, during the past 50 years, the trend of solar activity is downwards. So what solar activity would tend to be doing is causing a cooling. And it probably is countering to a slight extent the influence of CO2. And just recently we've gone through a minimum in the solar cycle, and now it's increasing. So there will be a slight tendency for the increasing solar output to add to the CO2 over the coming few years.
Yeah, I want to go to Gerald Fleming because he's blamed for every ruined barbecue. We had the coldest winter just about anyone's memory, and people would say, how is this possible to have a cold winter and the best snowing in the Alps? Not for 1 year, but 2 or several years now, we've had the best snow. And a coldest where I am in Kildare was minus 20 degrees. Now, this is not evidence to my mind, I know it's the short term, of global warming.
Yeah, it's weather, it's not climate. We talk of climate change, we must look at longer time periods. We had a cold winter. Other parts of the world had a mild winter. I mean, we needn't be too European-centric or Ireland-centric in terms of the way we look at weather.
Or even Kildare-centric.
Or even Kildare-centric. I know people in Vancouver had great problems getting snow for the Winter Olympics, which were there. But the point really is that the last winter was cold, the previous winter was moderately cold, the previous 10 winters were very mild. So if you want to look at climate change, you've just got to look at longer timescales. Weather will always be there. You will always have warm years and cold years, dry years and wet years, and that will happen in 200 years' time no matter what way our climate is. There will be variability, but you've got to get at the longer time scales to see the underlying trend.
Joe, well, the point is that you can't judge these things by one season's weather or 2 seasons' weather. The overwhelming evidence is that something grave is happening to the world. How can you deny that? I mean, the glaciers are melting.
I can deny it very simply. We're actually right in the middle of a scientific experiment ourselves because of China. China has thrown up into the atmosphere the greatest increase in CO2 emissions in our history because of Chinese industrialization over the past 15 years. If we take a look at that and place ourselves in the middle of that experiment, we'll take a look at what has happened over the past 12 years. According to UAH satellite data and RSS satellite data, we've been cooling for the past 12 years, and in particular the past 12 years, and in particular the past 3, significantly cooling. So let's wait and see what happens with this huge expulsion of CO2 emissions. So far we're cooling. We've yet to see evidence of warming. And again, it's just in reference to what Gerald was saying there about cycles. He mentioned a few different cycles. Ray mentioned an ocean cycle, but neither of them really mentioned the effect of solar cycles. Solar cycles are driving climate and temperature. And as far as Ray mentioning over the past 150 years, 0.8 degree of warming over 150 years of industrialization throughout the world, that 0.8 is within the margin of error. If you go back 150 years, you'll find the instrumentation used to measure temperature wasn't quite that accurate. So the margin of error is actually bigger than that 0.8 of a degree.
Gavin's really enjoying this. Off you go, Gavin.
I've heard it so many times. I swear, it's like really they've hitched their wagon to a dead horse and they're flogging the hell out of it. I mean, there's a big report coming out tomorrow. It's going to be, it's not based on computer models. It's based on actual measurements, and it supports what the computer models are saying. And it is clear that the last 3 decades, each decade has been warmer after the other. How long do we have to wait until we actually wake up?
I'm not arguing with you. I'm just trying. You see, I'm in the middle here, all right?
Sure.
Now, what I keep on hearing in all these arguments, I'm inclined to be skeptical about all matters, all right?
And it's
but
good
what
to be
I hear
skeptical.
is people have got, it seems to me, perfectly well-argued cases with the facts to prove and justify their argument.
Listen, we've got 2 eminent scientists and we've got 2 guys in a pressure group. I mean, let's measure for measure. I mean, in all
Ultan,
honesty,
you're a pressure group. You're not a scientist.
This is, well, that's, you know, some of the most respected people in the world make very big mistakes, and our belief is that science has been politicized. It's sad that people are just going to look at the last 30 years and say, oh, that's only human activity, when we're in a normal cycle of this could be completely outside the sphere of human influence. Now, if I go back to, say, Gerald, for example, there's a couple of things that are quoted just like from a Bible, that, you know, human CO2 it was originally 270 parts per million. Well, in 1939, there was a guy called William Crutz did 64,000 chemical measurements of the atmosphere using a gas analyzer. And he measured, this is 64,000 over a 2-year period, and he came with accuracy of 1.5%, and CO2 in the atmosphere was at 417 parts per million. So, you know, the 270 parts per million figure comes from ice cores, which has never been validated. The method has never been validated. So a lot of what's been, you know, the theory is built on very shaky grounds.
not at all.
Completely.
Could I come in?
Yes, you can.
Sorry, I have to laugh sometimes.
Right.
Yes, well, I'd like to deal with this point that the theory is based on shaky ground. The theory is not based on shaky ground, it's based on very solid ground.
But it is a theory.
Let me just tell you what happens. If you double CO2 instantaneously in the atmosphere, you can calculate the change in the radiation at the top of the atmosphere. A doubling of CO2 will lead to a 4 watt per square meter decrease in the outgoing radiation from the Earth. That means that the incoming solar radiation exceeds the outgoing radiation at the rate of 4 watts per square meter.
Okay, keep it simple for people at home, because, you know,
Now, 4 watts per square meter significant or not?
This is theoretical, Kevin.
4 watts per square meter is equivalent to a 2% increase in the energy output of the sun. Now, 2% change in the solar output is huge.
But that is hypothesis.
Think about
The model might not be hypothesis, but the actual, whether it's applicable to this world, is hypothesis. I think Joe was saying that.
This is not a hypothesis. Can I just say one more word about this?
Yes.
The doubling of CO2 and the calculation of the 4 watts per square meter is not a hypothesis.
No, I wasn't talking about that. I was talking about whether it
this is
applies
based
to the
on
world
laboratory experiments.
Yeah, exactly.
And physics.
Exactly. It's a laboratory experiment.
If your average body temperature, if you healthy, fit human being, about 37 degrees centigrade, if you got a 3.5 degrees centigrade above that, right, and you would actually be in an emergency ward, 3.5 degrees change in your body temperature. It's that subtle. That's what we need to be mindful about climate change. We're actually likely heading towards 4 degrees warmer by the end of this century. That is critical. It is really, really critical. And the longer we stay in this fuzzy world of debating whether or not, we're just going to get warmer and warmer. We'll be like that frog in the boiling water.
Joe, I'm going to give you 1 minute, or briefly on your point. I want to shift the argument to somewhere else in a minute. So just finish what you want to say.
I just want to thank Ray for making our point. He just gave away the whole ship. He said that it's measured in meters squared. A metre squared is basically a two-dimensional slice of the atmosphere. That does not, a metre squared will not give you a picture of solar variation. What will give you a picture of solar variation is a metre cubed, to observe it in a metre cubed, or better still, to measure it in a kilometre cubed. But they're measuring it in a metre squared. He gave it away right there. That's it. That's the Achilles heel of their whole argument. You can't measure solar variation
2 dimensions
in a squared metre.
Okay, can we just move on to what is possible? What is possible? Just allowing for the fact that you, global warming people, are right. Can we do anything about what's happened to the levels of oxygen in the world? Since the first Kyoto conference, or the first of one of these conferences, or Rio, I can't remember where it was, the carbon dioxide emissions across the world have increased. All we've done is diminish the increase, but we haven't diminished the overall levels of carbon dioxide. And one of the things that really insults everybody is that these conferences are always held in Rio or Kyoto, never in Baholo or Lurgan. So there's a kind of a plausibility problem there. But what are we going to do about China's 500 coal-powered coal-fired power stations? How can the world do anything about that? These are
enormous problems. I mean, really, this is such a stressful situation for our species. How do we address these realities that are emerging around us? I wish we were talking about that for the programme, as opposed to whether climate change is or isn't happening.
Yeah, but that's what we should be discussing. I've just asked you the question.
Well, we need, as a global society and as nation states, to manage our carbon emissions, to use less fossil fuels, to prepare for. Okay. You tell me the answers. Come on, you come up with some solutions.
I'm entitled to say these are pieties, but they're not answers. I'm not here to give answers.
I'm not here to tell you what to do with your life, but as a society and as a species, we need to address this new reality. This is the challenge of our generation. Are we prepared to rise to it or not? That's the question.
Well, Ultan, is it a reasonable thing to tell the Chinese and the Indians to stay in the levels of poverty that they are at the moment relative to the hundreds of thousands of millions of people? Should they cut economic growth in order to stay impoverished?
Absolutely not. And the contrary argument is that CO2 will have a beneficial effect on our atmosphere, because the actual, in reality, the average CO2 in history is about 1,000 parts per million. About 450 million years ago.
With dinosaurs on the Earth.
Yes.
Absolutely.
There's
no humans.
Well, plants evolved in an atmosphere with CO2 at far greater levels than they are today. And they're in a relatively...
That's a long time ago. I want to deal with tomorrow.
Well, tomorrow.
Today.
Well,
yes.
there is. If we've evolved to today, and it was, for example, the medieval warm period is a historical fact. No matter how much the IPCC want to hide it, the medieval warm period, we came through it. It was a degree warmer than it was today for 300 years.
Sure, they were growing tobacco in Warwickshire in the 17th century. They're not growing tobacco in Warwickshire today.
They're growing better wine now in the north of France and in Germany because of climate change.
Yeah.
They have an extended growing season compared to what they had.
Just to go back to the point about India and China. Are you going to tell the Chinese and Indians to stop economic growth?
Well, it's not my job to tell the Chinese and Indians what I do think. And it's an interesting point, because what was attempted at Copenhagen, which was unfortunately didn't happen, in my view.
It didn't happen. It's not your view. It didn't happen.
It didn't happen. No. Was that Europe was trying to take some sort of a lead. It's difficult to tell the Chinese and the Indians or whoever that you can't develop if those of us who, if you like, have lived in a very developed society and have all the benefits of developed society are going to continue doing what we've been doing all along.
We used to live in a developed society.
We still live in a developed society. I mean, if you want to...
Since Mr. Watt invented his steam engine, we've been throwing this stuff into the atmosphere, so we're years ahead of them, you know.
Ray, you're looking thoughtful.
Attempt to try and take
we're running out of time, and Ray's looking very glum, and I want him to get a word in before.
Well, I think the IPCC made a big mistake in trying to hide the medieval warm period, or in accepting the graph called the hockey stick, which showed there was no medieval warm period. The statistical methods on which it was based were shown to be false by 2 Canadian statisticians. And there is no reason not to accept the truth of the medieval warm period. Of course there was. We know the Vikings were in Greenland. But we don't know what the solar activity was at the year 1000. And it could have been sufficiently stronger than today's to bring the temperature up that amount. But we do know in the past 100 years that CO2 has been going up significantly. We know that CO2 absorbs infrared radiation, that it doesn't do so in a trivial way, it does so in a very significant way.
Okay, we're going to come to the end here with Gavin's final words, and it's just a couple of words to close the argument from your point of view.
Well, I wish we could move on from is it, isn't it? Because really, the science is clear. It is now, and you'll hear it in the newspapers tomorrow, undeniable. And that's where we need to go. Kevin, we need to hear likes of you coming up with solutions and not asking me what's going on.
Oh, it's a pitiful world indeed that depends on me to solve any of its problems. Listen, thank you, gentlemen. We'll have more discussion along with a preview of tomorrow's newspapers after the break. Welcome back. Marion McKeown and Anton Savage join us now to take a look at tomorrow morning's papers. The headlines, or the front page of the Daily Telegraph, seems to be based on the first half of this programme. From sea to sky, unequivocal evidence of global warming, says the Telegraph. And the Cross-Channel Independent from London is pretty much on the same lines. It says the Dead Sea on its front page. The microscopic life that supports the marine food chain is dying out. The consequences could be catastrophic, says the Independent. The Irish Times now tells us that the regulator signed off on the 169 million. I'm sorry I fumbled there. I just can't believe what's going on with the regulators. And if sometimes I start speaking Tibetan, it's because the English language is no longer capable of capturing the lunacy that we're living in. I'll start the headline again. The regulator signed off on a 169 million loan from Anglo to Quinn. I'll move on from the Irish Times to the Irish Independent. Big story today, of course, broke yesterday and will carry on to tomorrow. Arnott's may be sold for £1 as banks tighten grip. This is a wonderful country to be in, living in these days. Oh, well, the Irish Daily Mail agrees with me. The worst country in Europe to have a mortgage, as if we didn't know. Yes, the Irish Examiner tops that one with Fraud Squad probes 15 bank cases. 15 bank cases. And the Irish Daily Star goes back to the kind of cultural divide which we see in the tabloids a great deal. Not that they're wrong to have a cultural divide, it's just there. A man shot dead on first family holiday, that tragedy in Spain. Marion, what struck your fancy here there?
Well, you know, none of those. I found them all very depressing and grim. What I'm fascinated by is Winston Churchill's gold-plated dentures are for sale, which is on the front page of the Daily Telegraph. And apparently, as we all know, he was a great orator. He was famed for his speeches and for motivating people in difficult times. However, the price of them is to be the guide price. They're gold-plated, which would mean that of themselves they must be worth a little bit. They're Winston Churchill's, which you would imagine would add a little more value. But the guide price is only £4,500, which you'd think would be the price.
To £5,000.
To £5,000. Surely a normal pair of dentures costs that much. I would have thought
Fortunately,
Winston's were worth a bit more.
This is a state, auctioneers' capers, isn't it? They're playing a game with us. You know, this kind of thing happens the whole time. You know that I don't know how much dentures will cost.
Well, it begs the question.
Yeah, but I know this is a stunt. It's a stunt to get people.
You think it is? Oh, you're very cynical, Kevin. You're very cynical.
Did he have a slot for his cigar there in his false teeth?
Well, there seems to be a little hole if we look closely at the picture. I think there may be. He may have slotted it in there. But they're a fine-looking set of dentures and lots of gold.
Unfortunately, I've just been told from the control room that the viewers at home can't see the graphics, which is tragic.
You'll have to go and view them and buy them.
Yeah.
Another story I'm interested in is also an international story. The Catalan Parliament, which, as you know, the Catalan regards itself as a very, very, very separate district to the rest of Spain and a region that is autonomous and seems to have no great fondness for the rest of Spain, and they have outlawed bullfighting in Catalan, in the Catalan region, and in another break with Spain, which I suspect is all about showing how culturally separate they are from Spain. And the Catalans seem to regard their fellow Spaniards with something close to contempt. And I was interested in seeing that the comments and the people on the street who were being spoken to were saying, well, yes, we're obviously so much more civilised than those Spaniards.
It's like going back to the Anglo-Irish agreement. Catalonia says no.
You could say that. Yeah. Other stories that, let me see, I think the Arnott's closed down, and it's going for €1, not even £1, Kevin. I'll have to correct you there. Even less than £1. I know there's a sale on there, but really, this is getting ridiculous. I think that's going to cause a lot of, you have to keep business and emotion separate. I think a lot of people are taking a very emotive response to this sale of Arnott's, and they see it as an institution that's been there since 1843 or whatever. And
I take it emotionally because that's my money going into.
But that makes me feel a little emotional too. Actually, that makes me a little upset about that. But I think that it's a sort of a, if you want to look at the whole Celtic tiger fable in a microcosm, isn't that it?
Do you know where the people in the 1916 Irish Citizens Army got their uniforms for? They got them from Arnott's. They went along to Arnott's and got Boy Scout uniforms the week before the Rising, or sometime before the Rising, and they modified them to make them look more paramilitary than they actually were. But they were actually Boy Scout uniforms bought from Arnott's. So Arnott's has a little place in Irish history.
It really has a part in Irish history, doesn't it then? And then, as you said, the cover of the Daily Mail, and indeed, as you also pointed out, the worst country in Europe to have a mortgage, no surprise there. But it really does seem that now that these tracker mortgages are no longer available, it's all variable. We have 70%. 8 out of every 10 new home loans are variable, which means that everybody is at the whim of the banks, essentially, as if we weren't already. So very little good news in this neck of the woods, I'm afraid, at the moment.
Somebody once tried to explain to me what a tracker mortgage was, and then he started talking in Persian at that point. So I never understood what it's about.
I thought you could speak Persian.
Yeah, sometimes I can. Welcome, Anton.
Thank you. Well, can I follow Marion on the basis that says an awful lot of this is depressing, so let's dig out the bits that aren't necessarily so. There's a story which it isn't in the print yet, but it's running on the mobile edition, so I'm assuming it's going to make it into the Irish Times, which is a court case that came to fruition this afternoon. And it's an interesting court case because it is a story of such continued bad luck that I think it's worthy of a mention. It's the story of a man who has a bad road history because he had an accident in the late 80s, which he subsequently sued for compensation and got the compensation. More recently, he's had another 2 crashes, both instances, sued for compensation, got compensation. But the court case today involved his wife being in an accident. Now, his wife had an accident and sued the people who were involved in the crash and got compensation. But the bad luck isn't just that his wife was involved in a crash. While she was still at the scene, his mother-in-law showed up to the scene, saw what had occurred and contracted post-traumatic stress disorder. She sued and got compensation. And what came out today was he had taken a case because subsequent to the accident, his wife had been told, look, you probably shouldn't have any more children. And he said, well, look, I'll take one for the team. I'll get a vasectomy. So he gets the vasectomy and subsequent to it gets some side effects and some minor pain that he wasn't expecting to get. And he sues the people involved in the crash for the pain that he got from the vasectomy that he had to have because his wife was in a car crash.
Okay, now I just tell everyone at home, this is not in what the papers are in front of us. This is what you saw this afternoon.
This is on the iPhone. I dug it out of the Irish Times. Doing research.
You do know this is cheating. This is a violation of the rules.
But this is me trying to help.
You might be expelled from the studio for this kind of conduct. We can't allow people coming in with stories of their own.
It is good though, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, it's a nice story if it's true, but you've got a very fertile imagination. I've heard you on the radio. I mean, you've got a very... You're also a racing driver, aren't you? You're a racing driver.
Yes.
So, can we trust the imagination of a racing driver?
It is not me. It is the paper of record on the
so
mobile
I want the cameras to focus in on that face. Is that a face of an honest man? Look, we went to the trouble of looking at computers and stuff online to get real stories, and we've got the workings of your wonderful imagination.
Here.
Give us a story.
From the papers, the interesting stuff in the papers, one of the things about the Arnott's thing, Arnott's, as you said, euros for euro. What's interesting about it is that the sheer level of debt, because at the moment it has a debt burden of close on 300 million euro. Its turnover, if I have this right, is 128 million euro. Now, I don't know what the net margins are in retail, but even if you're making a 10% net margin, that's 20 years to pay back the existing debts that are in Arnott's. That's a fairly astonishing level of debt burden for any company to have. The other thing that's cropping up a lot, and it links together with the Arnott's thing, is the regulator and Anglo. The guards have said that they are preparing a file for the DPP. You made reference to it with the 15 different things, but the guards have said that they believe it will be a slow burner as they wade through everything that happened around the ILNP and Anglo transactions and all the rest of it. And what the front of the Irish Times is running with is the thing that says that the regulator signed off on the 169 million to Quinn. And what's interesting about this is it means that, you remember he had the contracts for difference around effectively paralleling Anglo shares at the time.
No, but just hurry on, because we're going to lose you. It gets complex here.
Well, effectively, he'd made a bet.
No, don't tell me more. I'm asking you to tell me less.
Okay. Regulator and you.
Okay. Ray, there's the stuff about the on the scientific stuff which might have attracted your attention on the planet dying. Did you see that in the Telegraph on the Independent on the front page? Is that kind of sinister confirmation of what you were saying earlier on?
Well, the increasing carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, a lot of it goes into the ocean. So increasing acidification of the ocean is one of the effects of increasing carbon dioxide. And that could be equally as serious as temperature change and melting ice. If it starts to interfere with the ocean ecosystems, it can be very, very serious.
That's the Independent story. Ger, the Telegraph has on its front page story, from sea to sky, unequivocal evidence of global warming.
Yeah, this is from the annual State of the Climate report, which comes from NOAA, from the American Space and Oceanographic and Air Administration, and it's a very definitive type of, authoritative type of report where they look at a huge range of evidence every year and give their proclamation, if you like, on the state of the climate. And they're saying unequivocal. I gather they also use the words undeniable, but that's a very strong use of language.
You people do say undeniable and unequivocal, don't you? Ultan, you want to say something here?
Yeah, I mean, this is the crux of the matter. NASA or NOAA use temperatures from the surface, and a guy, the founder of the Weather Channel in the United States, John Coleman, did a little study and discovered that NASA and the Goddard Institute of Space Studies excised all the cold spots, so their graphs look continually hotter. In fact, out of the 6,000 graphs that are 6,000 data points that they've been using around the world up to 1990, they're only using 1,000 today. So they've discovered that a guy called E. Michael Smith, a computer programmer who studied it, discovered that they got rid of all the cold spots. So now we're undeniably hotter.
I should tell the viewers at home that you haven't got notes in front of you. That's all inside your brain. Marion, you want to say something?
I find this kind of hair splitting, and I, with respect, I do say that a little beside the point, because I think people used to say the Earth was flat, and they had very good theories to support that. There is, I think, incontrovertible evidence that there is global warming, that there is climate change, and you look at something as simple as this, as the microscope. Well, we will have to differ up, because we don't have time, I think, to get into a bigger debate. But
we just had it. We just had it in the first half of the programme.
I'm glad I missed it.
Anton, I cut you short before. You've got something else in your brain now, because it's a very lively brain, and I'm sure it's got something there.
Well, let me lower the tone again. The Vatican's in trouble.
Yeah.
And apparently they're in trouble because...
this is news then, isn't it? Yeah.
Yes, they have poo-pooed tourists arriving in skimpy clothing.
But they've always done that.
Sure.
Well, I'm getting abused now for what the Independent group has said. It's just down it says the Vatican was under fire again yesterday. Now, there isn't again, but nonetheless, they're under fire for it. The other thing, by the way, on a more depressing note, there's two interesting correlations. You know the story about the young man who was shot in the Costa del Sol the other night?
Yep.
There's a story running in one of the papers about an Irish guy in New York who, an almost parallel, unprovoked attack. He was beaten up outside a bar in Manhattan and is now in intensive care in the Bronx. And the same thing, Irish guy out in a bar one night and just got set upon.
Yeah, we're looking at the papers the other day about the killing. I mean, I can't even remember the shooting in Fairview, and it reminded me of my days in Belfast, because this is almost sure, it happened in Spain, happened in New York, but more often than not it happens in Dublin, and it's just like living in Belfast. Not quite, that's an exaggeration, but the morning headlines, 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock, we're not surprised if somebody's been shot dead, and it is a shocking transformation of Irish life, and it doesn't seem to be reversible. Oh, come on, has anyone got something cheerful? I took a terrible turn to the sinister there.
A couple of points I would make. One in my professional area of expertise, if you like, in this question of the Dead Sea. I would have to say that, and the London Independent is I think, guilty of this a lot, the overhyping of stories to do with certainly climate change and with a number of other environmental issues, I find is not helpful. I prefer to get my information from thinking and reading in a deeper sort of presentation than is given here. And it gives the expectation that the world is going to fall apart tomorrow. That's not going to happen. on a point away from my professional level of expertise, but interesting, was the question of the bullfighting and the Catalonian. It's interesting because there was, I think, during the celebrations of the World Cup and that there was reports on RTE which were criticised by the Spanish ambassador here, where the Catalonians were...
Indeed was lodged, yes.
And there's an interesting background to that because there has been some legislation working its way through the Spanish system about granting Catalonia more independence, and it was passed by the Catalonian Parliament, passed by the Spanish Parliament, but has been challenged, I think, turned down by the Spanish Supreme Court. So there's a lot of underlying tensions there that are coming through.
Where are we always knocking ourselves? What other country in the world would a weatherman be an expert on Catalonia?
Not an expert, just
okay, if you're so good on Catalonia, can you tell me anything about Galway yesterday at the Galway races?
Galway, yeah, I have very little interest in racing.
Played a humble pie for the punters in Galway's big race, says Lisa Hand. Fingers off pulses, win surprises crowd. Any of you been to the Galway races?
Story here. I'm really sorry to get across. I thought you would have loved, and I'm afraid you missed it.
You're not sorry. That is such
I'm not sorry at all.
No.
I'm completely unsorry. You're dead right. The health minister in Britain and political correctness, which I know is one of your things, gone a little wild, was criticised. She wants doctors to tell patients they're fat. Stop saying you're obese because it's too polite. Just tell them they're fat and get on with it. But she's in a lot of trouble over this because people don't want to be told they're fat. They want to be told they're obese.
Well, there's once upon a time the word old was excised from pension, they became senior citizens, and it's just a Latin way of saying the Anglo-Saxon. Well, yeah, obese means fat in whatever Latin or something.
You call a spade a spade, you're fat, you're fat.
But whether you call it a digging implement, it's still a digging implement.
Syllable to say fat.
Just talking about Galway races, I was there once. It was an abominable affair. 200 million people with no lavatories, no food, nothing to see.
Well, if you don't exaggerate. You don't want the latter.
You want one or the other.
Ideally the former. You don't want food and no lavatories. Better to have lavatories and no food.
Okay. I'll eventually, my dear Watson. But have you ever been to the Galway races?
Never.
Yeah?
Yes, I have.
And what do you think?
Well, I just thought it was a fest for helicopters. I don't know what it's like now in recent years.
It used to be like Vietnam.
It was. I think it was the biggest helicopter event in Europe. Yeah. Something like that. It was more than Silverstone.
See, that should have told us. That should have told us when the capital city of Connaught, home of the famine, had become this mecca for helicopters. That should have told us we are in dire trouble.
Well, I think when you have more helicopters than horses at a race meeting, the race meeting's in trouble.
Nowadays there are no helicopters, but the crowds are turning up in Galway. I mean, the one of the things about the Irish experience in life is that people are extraordinarily resilient. I mean, there is an awful lot of boastfulness about this, but it is genuinely true. Irish people do fight back. We get knocked down. Awful things happen to us. A lot of it's self-inflicted. But one way or another, we just do keep on reappearing. I remember being in Bosnia with a Danish UN officer, and we had a little foxhole, a bit of trouble going on. He said, "Where are you from?" I said, "I'm from Ireland." He said, "Ireland?" He said, "Denmark is the same country as same size as Ireland. Wherever I go, I meet Irish people, but I never meet a Dane." And that's the point, is that there's a kind of ubiquity about Irishness and a kind of courage and determination about Irishness. So here we are in the middle of this extraordinary economic boom, and all the people are turning up at Galway races.
You could call it denial.
It is denial. It is denial.
Resilience, denial, they're the same thing maybe.
A headline that I find interesting here is the one on the Irish Times, page 16, improving unity among EU states, key to maximising our political weight. I think it's about time that Europe started exerting itself and showing its weight in the world. Europe's pretty divided at the moment. There isn't. You can only throw your weight around if everyone's united in the act of throwing the weight. Yeah, well, even in relation to the Copenhagen Summit on climate change, Europe was divided between New Europe and Old Europe, as to use a phrase of Donald Rumsfeld.
Yeah.
But there was a very different approach to climate change.
So you're saying that Europe isn't united. That's my argument against Europe. It's not, I want Europe to be united. Sorry, Mr. Freud. But the actual fact is that the economic and cultural impulses are in different directions. Look at Catalonia. Ask the weatherman beside you. Catalonia is almost seceding from Spain. Scotland's seceding from Britain. So what chance is there for Europe?
Well, Europe allows us to be different and to have separate regions which have a certain amount of autonomy while still being European. And if we have a central voice with a common foreign service, it can represent our interests in the world.
The central voice is saying goodbye. That's it for now. Thank you to all my guests. For more on tonight's show, log on to tv3.ie. The weather's next. From us here tonight, good night and thank you.